you cannot micromanage your teams. You have to give them your commander's intent. What is the mission? What do you want accomplished? If you're just focusing on the tactic, you're never going to get anywhere. But if you can explain it as part of your strategy and you use the example of military strategy, all of a sudden it starts opening up the possibilities. A lot of people, they want to figure out, why is my team not innovative? You cannot command innovation. But what you can lay out is your commander's intent, and then you let your team and the culture you're building, that's what creates the innovation, not you micromanaging it. One of the easy metaphors that I use a lot in my talks is that, everybody in the Army can shoot. So just jumping around and knowing how to shoot doesn't win you any battles, right? It's the strategy that's being employed and how to deploy, the infantry or the armor. That's what wins you the battle.
Welcome back to the Hustle and Grind podcast, the show where we dig into why real entrepreneurs trade comfort for conviction. This isn't about vanity metrics or overnight success. It's about the stories behind building a reputation that actually matters. I'm your host, Andrew, keynote architect, platform builder, and fellow founder in the trenches. Today, I'm sitting down with Lee Pepper, a leader who spent his career building high-performance teams. From his time as an Army officer in the United States Army to working on Ross Perot's presidential campaigns, Lee has a unique perspective on leadership. He took that experience to Foundations Recovery Network, where as CIO and CMO, he helped grow shareholder value by an astonishing 60 times. After a $350 million acquisition, he went on to build internal marketing teams for other major healthcare companies. Now a consultant and writer, Lee also gives back by mentoring veterans. He's here to talk about what it takes to build teams that don't just survive, but truly thrive. Let's dig in. Lee, thank you so much for being on the show today. Really appreciate it. I've read your book, and it's really going to be, I love the material you're going through, and I'm really looking forward to asking a bunch of questions. So thank you so much for being on today. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely, Andrew. I'm so glad we got connected a few weeks ago, and just, honored to be of service in all your endeavors.
Absolutely. So let's jump in, because you've mixed two things that I never thought I'd hear mixed. And as soon as I started to get into it and get my hands into it, it made sense. But the military, U.S. Army specifically, thank you for your service, appreciate it. And then marketing. And I think when you first think about those two things, you don't necessarily make the correlation right away, but it makes some sense after you're finished. Go into how you actually, where did it transpire that you ended up in the marketing industry? And let's start there first. What was the series of events that got you into marketing?
Yeah, I think one of the big things with my career is that I have pivoted numerous times, and I think that is another one of those areas in the military that a lot of people don't think about. That in the military you really do have to pivot quite a bit. So coming out of college, I had enlisted when I was in college, and then I was a political science major. And as a political science major, I got a job working for Ross Perot, on his 92 and 96 presidential campaign. So I was probably one of the few political science majors that actually got a job, a paying gig, working in politics. And then I was just so fortunate that Ross went to the Naval Academy himself, and so he was a big proponent of supporting, those that had served. And so I got the chance to go work for Pro Systems, his IT services company. Well, where does a political science major fit into an IT services company? Well, I just raised my hand and I took advantage of every bit of training that I could get a hold of. And, this is at the advent of the internet. I mean, when I graduated college, the internet wasn't around. All our papers and essays were done on typewriters. So I was very fortunate to have been early on at the advent of the internet, and I was seated on a healthcare account. And then he bought a company in Nashville. I reloaded to Nashville, and like every entrepreneurial spirit, I wanted to go work for a startup. So I left after almost 10 years working with Pro Systems, and was able to go to a digital music company. But you know what, Andrew? We were on the wrong platform. We were on the Microsoft platform, and Apple ate us. And so that created a number of pivots there. I went from, political science to IT, and now all of a sudden I'm in digital music, which is a lot more, website and digital marketing work. And after we ran out of money at the digital music company, I went to go work for a healthcare company that was looking for a CIO. And back then, websites and digital marketing was under the purview of the CIO or the CTO because they really looked at it as being a technology. And so I just learned from the ground up there and then, quickly became the chief marketing officer. And so that's kind of what led me. And all along the way, I'm using these military strategies. This was my worldview. This was my mental models that I developed. And so it was just natural for me when I got into different roles in marketing. I would look at these challenges, whether they were IT, marketing, leadership. I looked at them through the military lens. And that's when I started writing some of these things down and doing talks and presentations that eventually led me to I think I have enough for a book.
Exactly. I think I'll write it all down eventually, And, I love the fact that that shows the true entrepreneurial spirit where it's like, I started here and then, hey, let's go see this problem, then here. And it doesn't have to be linear. I mean, and I like what you said about political science. My lawyer is a political science minor. And that's what he did before he got his JD. So,
right.
It's not something you would think about with marketing, but once you think about kind of what the political science side and the marketing, they actually kind of make sense, don't they?
Yeah.
I mean, because you're really looking at how people work in organizations and stuff. And I kind of liked how that, talk to me a little bit more about kind of what that.
Yeah, I think
what helps you with that.
I think one of the things that's really important to realize is that, nobody is born necessarily to be a soldier. Nobody's born into the military. And so I learned very early on as I was serving that I could learn. And luckily, the Army especially had amazing training and equipment. And so I was able to kind of learn. I mean, I didn't know anything. I was eventually I enlisted as a 76 Yankee supply clerk. I didn't know anything about supply. And then I went to officer candidate school. Then I went to air assault school. Then I went to armor school. I didn't know these things, but I jumped in and I determined that I was not going to be outmatched. I was going to learn everything I could. And I think that's the same thing when it comes to the corporate world. Like sometimes people are asking me, well, how did you go from this to this to this? Well, I dedicated myself to learning the craft. And I think that's where you get into marketing and where I see in the corporate side, especially young marketers having problems, is that they're starting with jumping around in tactics. And so what I try to lay out in this book is that you're not going to win any battles by just applying tactics. You have to start with the overall strategy. And, one of the easy metaphors that I use a lot in my talks is that, everybody in the Army can shoot. So just jumping around and knowing how to shoot doesn't win you any battles, right? It's the strategy that's being employed and how to deploy the infantry or the armor. That's what wins you the battle, not just knowing how to shoot. And I think in today's marketing world, we've made things so easy with all these different tactics so people can, use AI, especially now, and they can jump around and do these different platforms, but they're missing what the overall strategy needs to be. And that's where I try to bring some of these military concepts, to bear.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, I've known a couple of people that have done training for the military and, their training is second to none. And so, but going in and just learning it, going, hey, here's a problem. Let me deep dive into that and go forward from there. I really like that concept of, of being able to do that. And I mean, for me, it's come up with some cool stuff. So,
right.
So, I want to jump into something here because in your book, you bring up something called commander's intent. And for me, I think there's two different phases to this. There's a leadership lesson in here with commander's intent and understanding it. And there's a second part to it where you're applying it to marketing. And so first of all, in the organizations that you've worked with, when you're thinking about commander's intent, let's actually explain what commander's intent is briefly. How can it be applied to leadership and how can it be applied to marketing?
Yes, I think that's probably one of the tenets that you have to adopt after reading this book is that you cannot micromanage your teams. You have to give them your commander's intent. What is the mission? What do you want accomplished? Then you have to have confidence in your team. And that there's a lot of ways you can gather that confidence, training, have you done some practicing? I go through a lot of these different exercises in the book, wargaming, but you have to give your commander's intent and then let your team go and run with it. And this is one of the challenges, Andrew, that I think a lot of people, I'm 56. A lot of my peers have trouble leading millennials. I don't have any problem working with millennials. I love millennials. And it's because I practice commander's intent. I give them what the mission is, right? And the parameters to execute that mission. They go figure it out. But if you're the kind of leader that's micromanaging and has to make every little decision, you're going to have a problem dealing with millennials. And I think that is at the core of what makes the military so successful. A lot of people, they want to figure out, why is my team not innovative? You cannot command innovation. But what you can lay out is your commander's intent, and then you let your team and the culture you're building, that's what creates the innovation, not you micromanaging it.
Yeah. And I think that's one thing, and I love the fact that you brought this up, because that's one thing millennials are good at. Give them point A and give them point B and let them do what they do, because they're really good at bridging
Absolutely.
that gap. If you try to manage each one, they're not going to get it right. And this was something that I learned many years ago, and that's also a management style I have, is let me tell you why I want this. Let me tell you what the intent behind it is. And then this is where I want you to go. Here's the end goal. Figure out how to get there. I hired you. I'm going to terribly butcher this quote, but a friend of mine came up with a thing where he's like, look, don't hire your experts and tell them what to do. Hire your experts because of their expertise and say, here's the end goal. Go from there. So I think that's why it was important. And I wanted to hit on what commanders.
And that's where I think leaders, Andrew, leaders then will say, well, what am I supposed to do? Well, listen, you're setting up the structure. So you're making sure that the team is trained. You're making sure that they understand the compliance issues that may or may not. They need to understand the budget. What are the KPIs? That's what you're there to do. But that's why so many companies that I work with or consult with, that's why they miss the boat on some of these new things that are coming in. That's why they're still struggling with, I don't know what to do on TikTok, or I don't know what to do on Instagram Reels. Well, it's because you didn't set your commander's intent and let your team go and be innovative, right?
Yeah. And it's hard, especially as entrepreneurs and small companies, I think it's really hard for us to this is our baby. We have put a massive amount of effort into it. We are the ones working 7 days a week, 12-hour days. We are putting a huge amount of effort, and trying to give that up to somebody else is a very difficult thing, because we're the ones who are on the line if something goes wrong. And I think it's hard to step back for a second and say, I hired these people for a reason. They're there for it, And I think it also means, making sure that the right people are in the right place. It's another discussion, but understanding you're hiring the right people. So we talked about strategy and tactic in that. And you said earlier about how most people are kind of throwing a bunch of tactics at the wall without actually a strategy. I've seen this a lot in the companies that I've worked with or helped build in that. Specifically for entrepreneurs. So these are often companies that aren't really big, sometimes a solopreneur, sometimes 3 or 4 people. What recommendations would you give to people instead of just throwing a bunch of tactics? What strategies? Like, is that sitting down for a weekend and figuring it out? Is it, do I constantly have to change it? What does that look like to an entrepreneur in their companies, and how can they effectively do that?
Yeah, there's a lot of things in that question, Andrew. I think that the first thing to understand is that your strategy, it can morph, it can change, but you need to have one going in, and it shouldn't take you weeks to figure out, because most small businesses that I work with, they're very passionate, especially in the behavioral health space where I spend a lot of time. These are people that maybe have gone through their own recovery process or found their own sobriety, so they know what works for them. The question is, how do they then launch that to potentially, thousands or tens of thousands of other people? And I always recommend to them, listen, pick the one thing is working. Don't feel like you have to solve every problem right away. But if you can document, and that's one of the things that I think so many small companies struggle with, because they're like, well, I can't spend days or weeks in creating some bureaucracy. And I'm not suggesting that, but I am suggesting that maybe you need to write your mission statement down, and maybe it's 1 or 2 sentences, and don't let perfect be the enemy of good enough. And I think that you have to get kind of disciplined that way. And that's one thing the military is really good at, is making sure that things are documented. And so I think that that's one of the first things I would say. Just write it down. And then the same thing with your key performance indicators. A lot of people are always worried about, well, what are the KPIs I should be using? Listen, your KPIs are going to be different from your competitors, but you do need to document them. And then maybe they will change, maybe they will evolve over time, and that's totally fine. But I think it's just having some of that stuff down and not getting stuck with a lot of the platforms we have, Andrew. They'll give you hundreds of data points, and it becomes very confusing. What data point do I want to look at? And what I recommend is, pick your 3 or 4 that are important to you and run with those. Don't get don't get confused when you've got like access to Salesforce as an example, and so Salesforce is giving you, tons of data. It can be overwhelming. Maybe you need to just pick the 3 or 4 that are really critical to you and just manage those to start.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I think that's one thing that's hard, especially if you're chief everything officer of your company. It's hard to, to sit down and sometimes give that moment, especially if you're hoping that sales come in and you're trying to juggle all these balls. And I think that's something that could be really difficult for us. So I wanted to touch on a little bit. So now you founded the Foundations Recovery Network and a behavioral health organization. Tell us a little bit about that, and what was the series of events that kind of caused you to create that? Like, what happened? That innovation always comes from somewhere. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I was the first chief information officer at Foundation Recovery Network. So Foundations had been founded by an owner founder. It was a nonprofit. They then worked to get their first private equity sponsorship. Mm-hmm. And that's when they started building out their C-suite. So we hired a CFO, we hired, a CIO. They promoted their number 2 person to be CEO. And so we all of a sudden had this team, and I was the youngest one. And so they were very excited, because they liked what I was doing with digital marketing and also covering all the technology suite. And for me, it was funny, Andrew. I still remember the first interview I went on, because you have this imposter syndrome. I remember being in the parking lot and like going, what am I doing here? And I think that that's something that I always love to speak on with younger people, because it's all of us have gone through that. Yeah. All of us have. And so the question is, are you going to put that thought, aside and just go in and do your interview, or are you going to let that thought kind of scare you away? And so I've always been very good at just kind of letting those kind of obtrusive thoughts just fleet away. I honor that I thought about it, but then I just let it go away. And then I think back to that quote that I have on my challenge coin that I sent you and I talk about in the book. And it's like, you have to determine today that in the face of adversity, you are not going to be outmatched. And that was always been my mantra. It's always been something that has spoken to me. And so I walked in and I was just Lee Pepper, and I talked about what my background was. And I was fortunate enough that they, saw, a lot of capability in me. But listen, Andrew, we didn't build it. When we exited almost 10 years later and we sold to UHS for a record valuation at the time, we had gone from me, one person in the marketing team, to 30. We didn't do that overnight. We built it slowly. We measured everything. I was in tight partnership with our finance team. I was in tight partnership with our clinical team to make sure that we were delivering the kinds of patients that our treatment services could best serve. And I think that that's it's not always easy, but when you partner with your other corporate departments and they see you as a partner, all of a sudden they're cheering for you as hard as you're working. And I think that there was just some real special synergies there. And I talk a lot about that, in the book, and try to give young marketers some of the voice. And a lot of it was using these military strategies. Whenever I would start quoting Caesar, or Patton, people's eyes would glaze over and they're like, oh, we can't argue with Lee. He's quoting Patton now. Watch out. And so I do think that there's a lot in the book that can help young leaders and young marketers overcome some of the cognitive biases that plague our industry, because a lot of people think that they can do marketing. They think marketing's easy. They've got a cousin or a nephew that can build a website. And the next thing you know, you're like, well, what am I doing? How did I get here?
Well, I think that goes down to they're implementing tactics, not strategies. And this is something
Absolutely.
I've seen in a lot of companies where they're like, I need an Instagram person. I need a TikTok person. We need a fancy website with SEO. And they have no idea how the hell to use them in concert with each other. Mm-hmm. So it's these little incident things that just kind of happen here and there, that the buzzwords they think they need without having any idea. I think there's a lot of times that happens in leadership, but I think specifically with marketing, I've seen it the most. So you go through a concept in your book of like implementing, giving each person, because I kind of think this goes with it, giving each person to get each person in your company to think about marketing, where it's not just the marketing person telling you what to do, but it really permeates every part of your business. And go into a little bit more about that.
Yeah, this comes from a military concept of the citizen farmer, citizen soldier. And, back in ancient times, we didn't have huge standing armies. You would have a very small group that was specialized. They might be the king or queen's guards, the emperor's guards. But most of your army was coming from the landholders, who were required to then send a number of able-bodied, men, to fight, in times of war. And so I use that same, in doing my research and thinking about how I look at how in the corporate world, we are best set up if we can leverage our staff and our employees. And so when I think back to even the times of Revolutionary War, I mean, we were Minutemen. I mean, this was something that you were called up to serve. So you were doing your job as the farmer, but then in times of war. And I think the corporate world, we can apply the very same thing. We all have our corporate jobs. You might be in IT, you might be in HR, you might be clinical, you might be in accounting. But there's going to be times when we need you to market the company, right, to help us to share. And that's where most companies really miss out. And there's a few companies that do a great job. Starbucks is one that I mentioned in the book. But there's so many opportunities for companies to leverage these other areas. And it doesn't mean that they all have to run out and create TikTok accounts or Facebook or share their personal stuff. But it is about, can you participate? Because a lot of companies, especially in healthcare, have a hard time hiring. And so one of the best things you can do is to get your team to share their personal experience, working for your company. And that does a couple of things. One, it helps create an environment where people want to come work for you. People are like, you know what? I saw their post on Instagram, or I saw their post on LinkedIn. I want to work for that kind of company, right? And then it also helps with retention, because if you can keep your staff happy and understand the mission and why they're showing up to work, and you promote that internally and through marketing, all of a sudden people are like, wow, I can't wait to get to work today. And so many companies miss out on turning their citizen farmers into the citizen soldiers that they can use in marketing.
Mm-hmm. And you bring up an interesting example in the book, which honestly is something that I've done with the companies that I work in. I was always in the IT of the learning industry, so never, kind of in marketing, but not really directly related. Like, you wouldn't tie the two together. But if we're at a trade show, I'm in marketing. And because for me, that was what was needed at that point. You didn't need, and I learned this in IT pretty early, where if you're, especially with user interface design, a lot of times I call it when nerds attack. So it's like, technically it's very good. I used to work for a book publisher. I was working with them to help do alt text. So text on images that people can understand. If they're blind, it reads it off so they can understand what the image is for textbooks. And they built this new system. And from a technical aspect, the system was awesome. Like, it was well done. They had put a lot of time and energy into it and completely forgotten that users needed to use it. It was completely unusable to people who were doing what we were doing. And they got a lot of negative feedback for it because, again, they were trying to work this around. They were trying to think about it from a technical standpoint, not a marketing usability standpoint. I think that marketing and usability can be interchanged at this point because users got to use it. There's got to be something around that. But I think that's something that we get really narrow on is we think in one direction. We don't necessarily think, how am I going to be able to market this? What am I going to be able to do with it? So, it's something that I've seen.
And I think
it's something that's critical.
One of the key things I lay out in the book too is that, if you're going to work on energizing your citizen farmers, you have to put some of the budget for these different departments into marketing. Now all of a sudden you're making, like in the example I use in the book, I think with HR, human resources, it's like you should probably have somebody in marketing help you with Glassdoor, right? Or help you with your job postings, right? Just don't go to, Indeed, maybe get some expertise from marketing. And so you have to give them some of your budget so that now they're accountable and now they're part of your team and they'll do great work for you. And that was one of the examples I think I used in the book with our Heroes in Recovery movement that we launched at Foundations. And it was a series of 6K run walks around the country. And, we were certainly doing it to support our alumni teams, which were our third largest referral channel. And most people who get sober always remember where they got sober and they want to share the good news. So we created this series of events, but we energized our staff because when we were going into new towns where we were wanting to set up like an outpatient center or an inpatient center, we had to recruit. Well, if we could launch one of our events there and people could see the passion and the heart that we had, that helped us actually reduce the amount of money we had to spend recruiting. And then when you can engage your staff, right? And now all of a sudden marketing has got amazing video. We invite people to come on our podcast. We've got social shares. And so all of a sudden we were able to do that and force multiply, another chapter in the book, all that work and it became very budget friendly. That's probably why I always had a pretty good relationship with our finance team, because I was never the marketing guy that was always asking for more.
Wasn't the marketing black hole?
Yeah, right. Yeah. And I think that's what a lot of other departments and CEOs struggle with. They don't know exactly what marketing is doing. And that's where these military strategies can really help you, because when you're jumping from tactic to tactic, especially when you have older people that might be on your board or your private equity sponsor, your CEO, they don't understand some of these new platforms. So as an example, like with TikTok, they don't understand it. And so if you're just focusing on the tactic, you're never going to get anywhere. But if you can explain it as part of your strategy and you use the example of a military strategy, all of a sudden it starts opening up the possibilities and they connect, and no longer is it just this black box that nobody understands. And I hear it all the time when I go into consulting class, and they'll tell me, I don't know what marketing's doing. And I'm always like, what do you mean you don't know? Marketing, everybody should be complaining that marketing's wearing them out.
Exactly. It's such a crucial part of your business, and it's one that's going to get you clients in and gives you authority and various things like that. So it's really important. So Lee, thank you so much for being on the show today. Get your books,
Andrew. Thank you so much.
Never Outmatched.
Thank you.
Yeah. Absolutely. And so make sure you can pick up a copy of your book. We'll have some more in the description or in the show notes, so that way you can go through and get links, check out a little bit more about Lee. Lee, thank you so much for a great conversation. Really appreciate it. I love your take on marketing. It's a field that I think there's a lot of people in at this point. And I like to always hear somebody come up with some new way to handle it, new way to do these things, and something really innovative. So again, thank you so much for being on the show today and spreading your wisdom. I really
Absolutely.
appreciate it.
And keep doing what you're doing, Andrew. I think there's a lot of people that love learning and meeting new people like me out there. And it always I love challenging conventional thinking, and I appreciate and applaud what you're doing.
Awesome. Thank you so much, sir. Appreciate it. Thanks for tuning in to the Hustle and Grind podcast, where we unpack what it really takes to build something that matters. If today's conversation hit home, do me a favor. Share it with someone who's in the trenches too. And if you're building your own brand, platform, or message and want help turning that story into serious authority, head over to theauthorityforge.com to see how we can help. Until next time, keep showing up, keep shipping, and keep chasing the work that sets you on fire. I'm Andrew, and this was the Hustle and Grind podcast.